Well then, let us continue the exploration of Rings of Power with Episode 3, Adar. We begin by seeing that Arondir, after having been captured in the tunnel, has been taken to an orc encampment where they appear to be forcing people into slave labor. Arondir is chained and ordered to dig, although we don't yet know what for, and he meets a handful of other elves, including the Watchwarden and Medhor, both of whom were in the Tirharad garrison in Episode 1. I kind of hope they don't explain how the Watchwarden got himself captured, because it's kind of funnier to me to imagine it. He must have left Tirharad with the rest of the elves, apart from Arondir, as ordered by the High King, and although we only see a handful of elves in Tirharad, maybe 6 or so, I think it's reasonable to assume that as a military garrison tasked with maintaining order in a human village, there were significantly more than 6 elves present. Then I guess they just got attacked by orcs and dragged back here to dig holes? Or are they going to reveal that the Watchwarden and the other elves intentionally went looking for Arondir after he deserted in the name of love and ended up getting themselves caught? Sorry, I really should let this episode play before I start coming up with hypotheticals. Let's see if what the show gives us is any less retarded than what I just laid out. I will note at this point that, as far as we know, the orcs' plan is to tunnel underneath villages, ideally to abduct the populace, but presumably kill them if this is not an option, and to bring them back here in order to use them as slave labor. The tunnels presumably exist so that the orcs can travel without exposing themselves to sunlight, and using non-orc slaves also means they can work them round the clock without worrying about sunlight.
Oh yeah, it's all coming together.
Seems to make some degree of sense, doesn't it? Except that the orcs are able to dig in sunlight. They have suitable clothing to protect them, and they also have these large temporary tent-like constructs as a backup. This means that the orcs could do exactly what they are depicted doing in the show without requiring any slaves. Although the narrative consequences of them using slaves are not fully known at this point, it is safe to say that acquiring slaves in this manner is extremely risky, as people will notice when entire villages disappear off the map. This means that the orcs are risking being discovered, which would presumably prompt the swift arrival of an elven army, because they don't want to dig the holes themselves. We don't get a better reason, so I just kind of have to assume that they don't wanna.
Pretty pathetic, huh?
Cut to Galadriel on board the mystery ship that rescued her for the 4th time since she dived into the ocean, and we see that Halbrand is also on board. He brings her some food, and she questions if it is safe to eat, and Shifty McGee assures her that it is. It is then revealed that the ship they are on is crewed by an assortment of humans. The captain tells Galadriel that he is tasked to deliver her and Halbrand to his superiors. Galadriel notices that the captain has taken her dagger, and the ship arrives at its destination, Numenor. As with Khazad-dûm in Episode 2, Numenor looks pretty damn cool. You can certainly tell that buckets of cash were poured into certain aspects of this show.
There never was much hope.
Anyway, I don't know why it took me this long to notice, or maybe this is the first shot in the show that has made this blatantly obvious, but Galadriel is tiny. I thought elves were supposed to be at least as tall as the average man, like 6 foot at least, but Galadriel appears to be a tiny person. Turns out the actress playing her is a minuscule 5'3", which some would consider to be inappropriate casting for an elf of Valinor, but those people would in fact be sexist. To be clear here, the problem isn't that the actress is 5'3". The problem is that I can tell that the actress is 5'3". Anyway, we get a bit of world building, which is nice. We learn that Halbrand's ancestors, the humans of the Southlands, stood with Morgoth in the Great War, whereas the men of Numenor stood with the elves. As a reward, the Valar gave them this island where they built their city. This is notably framed by having Galadriel deliver this information to Halbrand, and the show has already made clear that Halbrand has no idea where he is, meaning that he does not already know the information that Galadriel is telling him. So apparently the writers are able to justify their exposition dumps when they want to, which makes a nice change. Galadriel concludes that she feels sorrow for the fact that Numenor has changed much since the Great War, but as she made clear previously, she has never actually been to Numenor until now. She continues that the elves used to trade with the men of Numenor, but the Numenorians began to turn away their ships and then ceased all contact with the elves. She does not know why this happened, but feels like she is about to find out. I'm actually mildly impressed. Rings of Power has just introduced a new location and used its characters to feed the audience the necessary backstory in a natural and explicable way in-universe.
Very good, Kronk!
Usually I would consider this kind of thing to be the absolute bare-bones necessity to write a competent story, but with something like Rings of Power, I feel like I'm going to have to appreciate what little it gives me. Finally, the captain says that Galadriel should
keep moving. You would not want to be lost here without an escort.
Implying that the city could be dangerous for an elf, implying that there are racial tensions between the elves and the men. This is an example of how to do this with a degree of subtlety, rather than having some rando reeing about you people like they had in Episode 1. I am getting the impression that the writers do occasionally know what constitutes competent writing. What is going on? Unfortunately, as I will explore in what some would consider excruciating detail, it's all downhill from here. Okay, so Galadriel values nature over cities, is really, really, really small. Trusts Halbrand enough to eat food that he gives her, and likes Halbrand enough to explain to him where they are. We then follow the captain, Galadriel, and Halbrand inside what appears to be a palace. The guards and the populace seem shocked at Galadriel's presence, likely because they have never seen an elf before, or potentially because they specifically recognize her. Halbrand starts to kneel before the Queen Regent, but is told that no one kneels in Numenor. This suggests that Halbrand knows how to respect royalty, but also indicates that he is unfamiliar with Numenorian customs, which makes sense as he has never been there before. The Queen Regent asks Galadriel's name, and she indicates that she is the commander of the northern armies of High King Gil-galad.
Galadriel of the Noldor, daughter of the Golden House of Finarfin, commander of the northern armies of High King Gil-galad.
Hey, it doesn't always have to be about you.
I think it's fair to assume that as the High King had sent her to Valinor in episode 1, Galadriel is no longer the commander of the northern armies, but her trying to establish a degree of authority and wearing her achievements on her sleeves in front of the Queen Regent of Numenor is probably exactly what this character would do. So, thumbs up. Genuinely, I mean it. I'm complimenting what Galadriel is doing in this scene.
Very good, Kronk.
Galadriel then asks that Numenor grant both her and Halbrand passage to Middle-earth. The Chancellor's response is that it has been a long time since any of their ships had made such a journey on an elf's behalf, and Galadriel then slips back into being an insufferable child with no understanding or respect as to the potential danger of the situation she and Halbrand find themselves in, and she decides that pissing everyone off is her best course of action.
It's because of the elves that you were given this island. Surely you can spare a few planks and a rudder.
Why me? Why me?
The Queen Regent then starts to correct Galadriel, stating that the elves did not in fact give the island to them, and that they paid for it in blood, likely meaning that as far as she is concerned, her ancestors earned the island by fighting alongside the elves in a centuries-long war. Galadriel, of course, sees this as a further chance to unleash her inner diplomat, and says,
"What the elf means."
Then if blood be the price of passage, I will pay it. But one way or another, I will depart.
This woman is now threatening the Queen Regent of Numenor by saying that she will get what she wants even if she has to fight her way out of the city. I've said it before, I'll say it again, Galadriel is an idiot. She even interrupted Halbrand's attempt to actually be diplomatic and keep things polite in order to insult and threaten the Queen Regent, seemingly unaware of the fact that quite literally the closest thing she has to a friend within at least a few hundred miles is Halbrand, and the two of them are not particularly friendly. The Queen Regent responds to this threat by saying, "Go ahead and try it, bitch," although not in those words, and Galadriel responds by saying, "I don't need permission to kill indiscriminately," also not quite in those words, and upon seeing these two women get increasingly hormonal, Halbrand decides to try and actually resolve the situation by offering to stay for a few days while the Queen Regent and the Chancellor consider what to do. The Chancellor accepts, but specifies that Galadriel be restricted to palace grounds. Remember this, likely on account of her implied desire to commit mass murder. And Galadriel states that she will not be made a prisoner. The Chancellor then says he has no desire to imprison her, and she will be their guest.
Do you know what autistic is?
Not entirely sure how you can call this person a guest given what she has just said to you, but okay, sure. This dude became Chancellor and yet is unable to know a security threat when it literally walks into the palace and threatens to kill people.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
Halbrand then thanks the captain and embraces him. This appears to tell us that Halbrand is respectful, and that he likely feels genuine gratitude for the captain as he saved his life. However, as we will soon see, he was in fact retrieving Galadriel's dagger from him. I am reminded, however, that the captain stated that he was tasked to deliver Halbrand and Galadriel to the Queen Regent, and the fact that this has not been mentioned means that she did not specifically ask him to go and find them, presumably meaning that the captain had generic orders to bring any shipwreckies to the Queen Regent. One would think that the Queen Regent would not personally grant an audience to anyone and everyone who arrives in Numenor, but, oh well, apparently she's not a particularly busy woman. This also means that in episode 2, Galadriel was indeed accidentally saved on 2 separate occasions by randomly encountering a boat in the middle of the ocean. And the problem with compounding contrivances is that they multiply. There might be a 0.1% chance that Galadriel accidentally finds a ship in the middle of the ocean, but for this to happen twice, that then becomes 0.000001%. And I still think I'm being very generous with these numbers.
Pretty pathetic, huh?
Anyway, Galadriel is clearly not happy that they now have to stay in Numenor for 3 days. Halbrand says to chill out because the Southlands will still be there in 3 days, and Galadriel responds, but will its people? There are quite a few things to highlight here. Firstly, Galadriel's goal had been to kill bad guys rather than save good guys, so it seems odd that she would show concern for the people of the Southlands, particularly to Halbrand, who directly called her out on precisely this bullshit before.
At last. A little honesty. If you want to murder orcs and settle the score, that's your affair. But don't dress it up as heroism.
Secondly, and yes, it is autism time again, Numenor is approximately 2,000 miles from Middle-earth. From doing some quick Googling, sailboats tend to travel at around 3 knots, meaning to travel 2,000 miles, it would take approximately 20 days. If we assume that they stay in Numenor for 3 days, then the Queen Regent is in fact kind enough to both agree to give them a boat and to sail them as close to the Southlands as possible. The best case scenario is that Galadriel will not be arriving in the Southlands for approximately a month. Now, Rings of Power hasn't really taken any care to depict travel time or distance though, so my guess is that this won't be how this plays out. Of course, leaving now does get them to the Southlands sooner than leaving in 3 days' time, so I can understand Galadriel's urgency, but this right here was the perfect time to inject a bit of realism into the world by acknowledging things like distance and the passage of time. Halbrand indicates that he wants to stay in Numenor rather than return to Middle-earth with Galadriel, and Galadriel says that he leapt into the sea to save one life, which was hers, whereas she seeks to save many. So, translation. I'm better than you, and also I didn't listen to what you just said. This is not a reply to what Halbrand just said. Halbrand then appears to ask Galadriel to let him stay in Numenor, as if Galadriel is in charge of him or something, and seemingly forgetting that the deal he just made with the Queen Regent was not, wait here for 3 days and then you can leave. It was, wait here for 3 days while I decide what to do with you. Halbrand then reveals that he took back Galadriel's dagger from the captain when he embraced him earlier, which he then returns to Galadriel. I'm not entirely sure how she is going to keep this hidden, but I guess we will see what happens. Halbrand then leaves Galadriel to consider staying in Numenor, even though Numenor isn't as nice as Valinor, and Galadriel leapt into the ocean to avoid Valinor, so I don't quite know why she's feeling any conflict here. Okay, so Galadriel wears her achievements on her sleeves, is not modest, doesn't care if she makes people angry, and is the opposite of a diplomat. And Halbrand knows how to respect royalty, prefers diplomacy to threats, and is willing to break the law. We then learn from the Chancellor that the captain who rescued Halbrand and Galadriel is Elendil, who, as we saw in the prologue to The Lord of the Rings, is eventually killed by Sauron before his son Isildur then defeats Sauron. As I have mentioned before, I am by no means a Tolkien lore purist. I think that, for example, including Tom Bombadil or the Scouring of the Shire into the Peter Jackson trilogy would have made it worse, even if that would have made it more faithful and accurate to Tolkien's original novels. Nonetheless, I do still think that it's worth highlighting what the writers of Rings of Power have done with the timeline here. Elendil and Isildur were both present for and responsible for Sauron's defeat in the year 3441 of the Second Age of Middle-earth. Rings of Power apparently takes place somewhere around the year 1500 of the Second Age. Numenorians can live anywhere up to around 400 years old, but even so, this means that the writers of Rings of Power have decided to shorten the original timeline by somewhere in the region of 1500 to 2000 years. Now, I don't consider this to inherently be a problem because I don't care how accurate the show is, provided it's good in its own right. But I have to wonder, how on earth are they going to get around this discrepancy, and why would they choose to do this? The charitable interpretation at this point would be to assume that they did this so that they can use the characters of Elendil and Isildur specifically and hopefully for something breathtakingly original, and this is not simply an excuse to use the characters with names that people will recognize, but until I know what the show is going to actually use them for, I can't really comment on whether or not it was worth bastardizing Tolkien's original timeline. Where was I? Oh yeah, so we see Isildur on a ship, and as a very quick aside, this dude here is the third actor from the TV show Spartacus to appear in Rings of Power. Spartacus is unironically a masterpiece. If you haven't seen it, definitely give it a watch. It is thoroughly entertaining. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, so the wind then tells Isildur his own name to make sure that the audience knows that this is the guy from he's in with the thing that they, and we see that he's learning to be a sailor. The scene continues by having metaphors that the writers thought sounded cool.
There is no harsher master than the sea. The sea is always right. The sea is always right.
And by having characters tell each other things that they already know.
9 more days. 9 more days.
Isildur, your sister's here.
We also learn that Isildur is eager to graduate and become a proper sailor, and we see that he has a sister.
There you are. Beric, my boy.
This is it, people. This is the one time that Rings of Power has actually got a chuckle out of me. Well, apart from this. Anyway, we return to the Queen Regent, who has decided to have a chat with Elendil. She asks him about his name, and he says that his name can mean elf friend. The Queen Regent asks him why he brought an elf ashore, knowing that, apparently, elves are unwelcome in Numenor.
Though elves have been unwelcome on our shore since the reign of my grandfather's great-grandfather, you chose to break with that precedent.
It was the sea that put her in my path. And the sea is always right.
The sea is always right.
The sea is always right.
Fancy way of saying holy plot contrivance, Batman, but okay. So I guess the writers are using the fact that the sailors are evidently taught that the sea is always right, whatever that means, to excuse or distract from plot contrivances? Oh, it's not a plot contrivance. The sea sent her to me. It was meant to happen, you see. The Queen Regent responds that the sea cannot commit treason, meaning that Elendil is responsible for his own actions, not the goddamn sea. And this also, unfortunately, establishes that bringing an elf to Numenor is considered treason, which, as an experienced captain, Elendil must have known, which means he intentionally and knowingly committed an act of treason because the sea is always right. Okay, so Elendil does what the sea tells him, even if this is an act of treason, and is not particularly perceptive. Before I continue with the analysis, this map has actually revealed that I was off by an order of magnitude when I previously criticized Galadriel's dive into the ocean and how far she was from the shore. I had previously stated hundreds of miles. I was wrong. Going by this map, we can see that Valinor is approximately twice the distance from Middle-earth as Numenor is. This means that Valinor is somewhere in the region of 4,000 miles from Middle-earth. Galadriel dived into the ocean with the intent of swimming 4,000 miles. This is approximately the same as swimming from the Bahamas to the United Kingdom. Now, autism time. Experienced swimmers can swim a mile in about 30 minutes. I think it's probably reasonable to say that Galadriel is at the very least competent at swimming, and because I'm feeling generous, I'll ignore the fact that she's wearing a dress and was carrying a dagger in one hand. This means that if she were to swim uninterrupted and unassisted non-stop without eating, drinking, or sleeping, as must have been her plan, it would have taken her 83 days to swim back to Middle-earth. Given that the world record for the furthest swim without assistance is about 77 miles, I don't care if Galadriel is an elf, she is not swimming that distance. And, as an added bonus, the fact that my distances were off means I missed an additional point of criticism. If the journey from Middle-earth to Valinor is around 4,000 miles, this means it will have taken the elves somewhere around 50 days to travel there by boat. As the show has already shown us via this convenient meteor that all of these plots are supposedly taking place simultaneously, this means that the timeline of Rings of Power is, in a word, fucked. We then return to Arondir, who is being forced to dig holes. If only Bronwyn was here, she knows all about holes. Sorry. We then see this orc forget that, as an orc, he doesn't like sunlight, and the only reason this happened is to communicate to the audience that orcs don't like sunlight. I know this is just some rando orc, and he isn't really a character, but the writers still decided to make him retarded in order to communicate information to the audience. Seems par for the course at this point. Arondir theorizes that the orcs have a vast tunnel network and that this is how they shield themselves from sunlight. We learn from Arondir's elven buddies that the orcs are searching for something, possibly a weapon, hence all the digging. We also learn that Sauron seems to be behind this. What we don't learn is how on earth the Watchwarden and the other elves from the Tirharad garrison got captured by orcs. Anyway, the Watchwarden tells Arondir that he has a plan to escape, and I'm wondering why he waited to enact this plan. I guess because Arondir is a primary character in the TV show called Rings of Power, and he has to go with them, rather than for any in-universe reason. Anyway, the orcs notice the three elves plotting their escape and tell them to shut up and get back to work. The elves state that there is a big-ass tree in the way and that they should go around it. The orcs say that the elves should instead rip the tree down and go through it. The Watchwarden then responds by saying that the tree has earned its right to be there because it's really, really old. This is a rather blunt way of reinforcing that the elves have a deep reverence for the natural world, but it seems to me to be rather impractical to be acting on these principles given the situation the Watchwarden finds himself in. There is zero reason why the orcs should not kill him for looking at them the wrong way, let alone for telling them how old a tree is. Instead of murdering the Watchwarden then and there for talking back to them and refusing to do what they have ordered him to do, one of the orcs decides to give him water, saying he has earned it for being brave. This ended up being a trick, however, and the orc decides to kill this rando rather than the guy who had been causing the problems. I guess he has to stick around to further the plot, maybe? Oh, maybe not. As a result of this, Arondir decides to cut down the tree, which, whilst clearly goes against his values, is the pragmatic thing to do. So, to summarize, the orcs ordered the elves to cut down the tree. The Watchwarden said no. Then the orcs kill one of the other elves, and then Arondir says yes.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
Arondir being the one to cut down the tree tells us two things. Firstly, that the Watchwarden is evidently willing to die because he likes trees, and secondly, that Arondir is willing to do things that go against his worldview in order to avoid needless violence. This is in character for Arondir, as he has been established to avoid violence when possible. I can't say if this is in or out of character for the Watchwarden because we don't really know anything about him, so I'll just say that it establishes him as being something of a moron, which calls into question how he ever became a Watchwarden. The scene ends with the orcs cheering on Arondir as he cuts down the tree, because I guess orcs really dislike trees. Okay, Arondir is pragmatic, does things he doesn't want to do if it will avoid violence. We then return to Numenor, and these two guards have a very strange exchange.
You will inform Farazon that she's escaped. I informed him last time. That was a dog.
But what does that have to do with it?
No. He's got a point.
What? Guard 1 said to inform Farazon that Galadriel has escaped. Guard 2 says no, because he did it last time. Guard 1 then retorts, last time it was a dog that had escaped, seemingly to counter what Guard 2 had just said, even though the fact that it was a dog last time is utterly irrelevant to the conversation that they are having. I simply don't know what the point of this exchange is other than to tell us that Galadriel has escaped, even though we can see clearly that Galadriel has escaped. They do at least show us that Galadriel is hiding her elf ears so as to blend in somewhat, which is nice, and she then eyes up a boat that she presumably intends to steal. She is then interrupted by Elendil, who has managed to locate Galadriel.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
Somehow, Elendil says that he can't let Galadriel take the boat, and he has been charged by the Queen Regent with making sure that Galadriel doesn't cause any further trouble, and that he believes that she saw this as some kind of punishment. Galadriel says that she has something in common with the Queen Regent and agrees that it is a form of punishment, presumably because she is aware of how much of an asshat she is. She then states that, actually, the reason why she thinks she has something in common with the Queen Regent is because both of them think Elendil should never have brought her to Numenor.
But what does that have to do with it?
No. He's got a point.
This, whilst true, doesn't follow whatsoever from the conversation they were previously having. This is becoming something of a running theme. Elendil casually says that he should call the guards to apprehend Galadriel, and Galadriel draws her dagger and threatens to kill Elendil in broad daylight, while surrounded by citizens and within earshot of the guards. Conclusion? Galadriel is willing to commit murder in order to get what she wants. She is also willing to murder with no regard for doing it quietly or subtly. Therefore, she is also an idiot, because doing so could only lead to her death. Anyway, as far as Elendil could be aware at this point, Galadriel has stolen back her weapon that he had confiscated previously and is now displaying intent to use it against him. He has more than enough reason to arrest Galadriel right now, but chooses not to. Elendil calmly points out to Galadriel that if she were to kill him, she would then be imprisoned in the palace, and Galadriel responds,
Who is this mortal who speaks to me as if he has the slightest idea who I am?
It doesn't always have to be about you.
This tells us that Galadriel is confident to the point of being cocksure and rude and demeaning and arrogant. Elendil replies by saying that Galadriel reminds him of his children in that she runs fast and blind, meaning he is correctly observing that she appears to be prone to acting without thinking. Galadriel's response is to apologize and put her dagger away. Just kidding, that would be nice, wouldn't it? Nah, she says,
Where I run and how I run there are none of your concern.
So Elendil then reveals that he can speak Elvish and that he learned it at their Hall of Law, which causes Galadriel to ask him to take her there. So the two of them leave the city and ride to the Hall of Law, even though Galadriel is a violent criminal who had been explicitly confined to the palace, and Elendil was tasked with making sure she doesn't cause trouble. His decision to take her on a sightseeing tour of Numenor is odd, but presumably it's necessary for the riders to achieve whatever their plans are. I also find it strange that Galadriel learning that Elendil speaks Elvish and that they teach Elvish at the Hall of Law is enough to immediately halt her plans to steal a boat and leave Numenor. I also have to wonder what exactly was Elendil's plan when he showed up and revealed himself to Galadriel. If she had ignored him and gone to steal the boat, Elendil would have had no choice but to stop her, which presumably would mean killing her. So it's lucky as hell that speaking Elvish to her just so happened to convince her to travel elsewhere rather than to try and steal the boat. Elendil cannot have known that this was going to happen. We then get this, which looks very nice and informs us that Galadriel really enjoys horse riding. Okay, so Galadriel is willing to commit murder to get what she wants, is an idiot, is cocksure, is rude, is demeaning, is arrogant, and really enjoys riding horses. And Elendil is calm, measured, diplomatic, confident, and not easily intimidated. Cut to Halbrand, who is still in Numenor and appears to be trying to get a job at the blacksmiths. The blacksmith seems to appreciate Halbrand's confidence, but states that he needs to earn his guild crest before he can forge steel in Numenor. He is then noticed by some locals as being the man who sailed with the elf. One of them sits next to Halbrand, and he just so happens to have a guild crest. I wonder where this is going. Are the writers going to set something up in order to pay it off 2 or 3 minutes later? You bet your ass they are.
Pretty pathetic, huh?
Man doesn't seem to like Halbrand very much, and Halbrand provokes him further.
We sail to our island, eating our food, drinking our ale. What will you take next? Our lands? Our trades?
Don't forget your women.
The man responds that Galadriel might prefer to ride his giggle stick instead of Halbrand's inferior one, and Halbrand surprisingly agrees. Then this happens.
How about this? Next few rounds on me.
How do you have money? Wait, why am I expecting an answer to this?
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
After making merry and having fun with the locals, Halbrand sneakily removes this guy's guild crest and leaves. So, how well constructed was this scene? The individual dialogue elements appear to make sense and be in character. However, the writers magicked Halbrand enough money to buy a few rounds for everyone nearby, which appears to be at least 40 people, meaning this isn't just some pocket change he could have scrounged up off screen since we last saw him. And just like that, in a couple of minutes, Halbrand has his guild crest, which makes me wonder why the writers decided he even needed a guild crest if they were going to resolve it in this way. Anyway, the man and his buddies follow Halbrand as they apparently noticed that he stole the guild crest. Halbrand offers the crest back to the man, stating that he doesn't want any trouble, and he tries to beg them not to beat him, and they refuse. This causes Halbrand to fly into a fit of violent rage, headbutting one man, elbowing another in the face, punching another in the face twice, punching another in the throat repeatedly before breaking his arm, and then slamming the first man's head into a brick wall. Well, this was quite the revelation. So I guess Halbrand was hiding something.
Appearances can be deceptive.
So, aside from the last man who drew a knife on him, this was far beyond a reasonable use of force. This means that whilst Halbrand would seemingly like to avoid violence, he is nonetheless a very capable fighter, albeit an overly violent and bloodthirsty one who seems to be barely in control of his actions. As a result of attacking these men, Halbrand is then approached by guards and apparently arrested, and the scene ends. So, Halbrand is provocative, overconfident, seems to prefer to avoid violence, is extremely violent when fighting, and is possibly psychopathic. We then rejoin Galadriel and Elendil, who have arrived at the Hall of Law. Galadriel tells us that the Hall of Lore was built by Elros, who is the brother of Elrond. She thanks Elendil for bringing her here, although I still don't entirely know why he did. Elendil tells Galadriel that the Hall of Lore was built by Numenor's former king, who was dethroned due to his loyalty to the elves. Elendil then shows Galadriel a scroll, which is the account of a human spy. And we are told that this spy drew a symbol to recall the location of the tower in which he was imprisoned. Galadriel then realizes that she had made a mistake. She realizes that the Mark of Sauron that I have referred to as the Magic E is in fact a map of the Southlands. See, it kind of looks a bit like the Southlands. She then tells Elendil that the writing on the parchment is in black speech and tells of a plan to create a realm where evil would thrive, and that this plan would be enacted by Sauron in the event of Morgoth's defeat. So, this very short scene tells us a huge amount that makes very little sense. I will bullet point my criticisms now. Why did Galadriel wish to go to the Hall of Lore? Why did Elendil take her to the Hall of Lore? How exactly does this very rudimentary symbol act as any kind of map showing the location of the evil tower? It is no more specific than simply writing, "It was in the Southlands somewhere." If the Mark of Sauron is in fact a map of the Southlands, then why did Sauron carve it into Finrod's body? And why was it on the table inside the fortress in Forodwaith? If the Mark of Sauron is a map of the Southlands, why did this unnamed prisoner draw this very specific symbol in order to remember where he was? Does this mean that the map of the Southlands is in fact not a symbol for orcs to follow? Black speech is the language spoken by Sauron and his orcs, so why is Galadriel able to read it? How was the human prisoner able to write in black speech? How could the prisoner possibly have known what Sauron's evil plan was? How did this scroll end up arriving here in the Hall of Lore? And why did Elendil show it to Galadriel in the first place? These are hugely important questions that are going to be extremely impactful going forwards. This is the writers informing Galadriel that she was right all along about Sauron. Who saw that coming? And all that it required was that both she and Elendil do things that they have no reason to do, that she inexplicably have the ability to read black speech, and that some unnamed human prisoner, who I assume will never be mentioned again, just so happened to figure it all out and write it down, and that this record somehow made its way to the Hall of Lore in Numenor. And of course, lest we forget, Galadriel is only in Numenor due to ridiculous confounding plot contrivances. This scene hurts my brain to even begin to think about how many problems there are with it. The absolute best thing the writers can do at this point is explain in detail how this unnamed human prisoner made this discovery, and how this information made its way back to Numenor. That would only solve maybe 10% of the problems with this scene, but at least it's a start. We then return to the Harfoots, who are doing this.
Nobody goes off trail. That's right. Nobody goes off trail.
This actually kinda makes sense. The Harfoots are very superstitious, so this almost cult-like behavior seems rather appropriate. We then learn that Nori's father can't walk properly as a result of acting like a moron. As a result of Nori breaking the rules. If you recall, it's Nori's fault, not his.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
Nori's mother then says this.
We're going to be left behind.
Come on. Come the fuck on. Can we at least try to be consistent? Are we really supposed to believe that in this extremely close-knit community of highly superstitious, insular, and cultish nomads who were literally just chanting, "Nobody walks alone," that they will simply leave one of their own behind because he has hurt his foot?
Oh yeah, it's all coming together.
I assume it's simply an impossibility that he ride on someone else's cart? Anyway, Nori's father then tells her mother how much he loves her and reassures her that they will make it to the Grove, suggesting that yes, it is in fact entirely their own responsibility to migrate with the other Harfoots, meaning that the entire concept of community support is utterly foreign to these simpletons. Nori's father then tells her mother that once Nori sets her mind to something, there's nothing she can't do. There's nothing she can't do. We then see Nori attempting to steal Sadog's book in order to locate the stars that the Knot Wizard showed her at the end of episode 2. Poppy tells us,
I don't want to help him.
Very good, Kronk.
Yeah, this actually makes sense, because there isn't any reason why you should want to help him. Poppy is totally correct here, but because Nori is the protagonist and not Poppy, it will of course turn out that, oh no, Nori is correct. Nori then blackmails her friend Poppy into helping her steal the book from the village elder by saying that if she doesn't, Nori will tell Malva that Poppy put fireweeds in her toe cream. Sure is convenient that Poppy put fireweeds in Malva's toe cream off screen so that Nori could use this information to convince her to help and thus further the plot. Is willing to blackmail her friends to get what she wants. Cut to Nori, who has located and is sifting through Sadok's book. I guess this didn't require any skills to acquire, she's got it now. Before Nori can find what she needs from the book, Sadok returns to his hut. Oh no, what an inconvenience. And we get a full scene of awkward humor that doesn't serve to advance the plot or characters in any way. If it was funny, I might forgive it, maybe, but it isn't. Sadok then gives a speech to the Harfoots, and he says this.
We remember those from prior migrations who fell behind. And should any Harfoot fall behind this migration, they likewise will be carried with us in our hearts and in our memory.
This tells us, and I have to assume this is not the writer's intent, but nevertheless, this tells us that the Harfoots are willing to leave behind their brothers, sisters, friends, children, and parents if they are unable to keep up. The Harfoots are unwilling to help each other migrate. If they are unwilling to help Nori's father with his broken ankle, then I have to assume they also would not help a frail elderly man, a pregnant woman, or a baby whose parents had died. The Harfoots are assholes, and this brutal every man for himself mentality is definitely at odds with what the Harfoots were established to be. While giving his speech, Sadok lists a few people who they left behind. One guy got stuck in the snow, and one family got stuck in a landslide. This seems to me like the writers are trying to obfuscate the implied heartless brutality of the Harfoots leaving people behind by mentioning 2 examples of people being lost due to natural disasters. Yeah, if only. We then get this. Well, fuck that, I guess. The Harfoots abandoned a mother who was trying to save her child. These people are disgusting. Why the fuck would you write people like this? In this one scene, the Harfoots have gone from bumbling innocent simpletons to barbaric troglodytes. Anyway, the Knot Wizard appears to have entered the Harfoot camp, and because he has cleverly disguised himself as a tent, no one notices. He takes the star map that Nori had left on the table. Apparently he knew to do this, which suggests that Nori is able to communicate, yo, I'm gonna get this star map for you and I'll leave it on the table. Come get it in like an hour or so, which I'm sorry, I don't believe you. That is, of course, unless him showing up here was not part of any plan and is therefore a contrivance in order to move the plot along. Meanwhile, Sadok continues listing the unfortunate Harfoots who they abandoned, citing that one was left behind due to bees.
Lovo Baljabook. Bees. We all loved him, but he wasn't Egypt.
We wait for you.
This isn't fucking funny. These people are monsters. Why would you do this? You know what? I don't care anymore. The writers have managed to ruin the Harfoots who are already wafer thin in their characterization.
Pretty pathetic, huh?
You then see the Knot Wizard accidentally set the page on fire, and oh no, he gets stuck in the tent and everyone's scared of him. And oh no, then he says, Nori.
This is the one thing we didn't want to happen.
Which is the one thing he could have said which would cause as much trouble as possible. Nori is then berated by Sadok for lying, stealing, and bringing a dangerous outsider into their midst. Nori defends her actions by saying that the man was lost and hurt, and what else was she supposed to do? We are then told that
our laws are clear. Any Harfoot that breaks them is to be decaravaned.
So, Nori's punishment for breaking the rules is to be decaravanned. Sadok, instead, decides that Nori's family will be allowed to join them when they leave, but that their caravan will be at the back, because I guess being at the back is a punishment of some kind. Unfortunately, as Nori's father has broken his ankle, which Sadok is very aware of, this will mean that they will fall behind.
And Nori walks alone. We're going to be left behind.
Meaning that Sadok has seemingly accidentally exiled them without exiling them. If his intention was to leave them behind, then why let them come at all? God damn it, Rings of Power, why do you always shit the bed when it comes to characters and plot? You know, the things that compromise a story. Anyway, to make sure Nori and the audience understand what has just happened, her mother says this.
You may as well have stamped our name in the book of the left behinds.
Nori continues to defend her actions by saying that the Not Wizard came here for a reason. She then says,
I know I'm not special.
Which conflicts with this line from episode 2 where she tells us that she does in fact feel special.
It's like there's a reason this happened, like I was supposed to find him. Me.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
Her mother replies that the tallest milkweeds get snipped, which I assume is a fancy way of saying stop being weird and do what you're told. Is willing to defend herself if needed, and does not consider herself special. Cut to Numenor, where we see the locals are apparently putting on a puppet show in which Galadriel saves everyone because she is the best, you see. We learn that Isildur seems to admire Galadriel, referring to her as the scourge of the orcs, whereas Elendil's daughter Eärien seems to disapprove. Elendil tells his children that he has been tasked with keeping Galadriel out of trouble, which raises the question of where exactly she is at this very moment, and why is he chilling with his kids instead of keeping Galadriel out of trouble?
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
We then get some family drama where the son wants to do the thing, and the dad says, no, I know what's best, you can do what I say, and I stop caring about this paint-by-numbers sitcom melodrama. Anyway, the conclusion of this scene is that Elendil tells Isildur that he will take part in the sea trial in 9 days' time, which causes Isildur to leave and presumably become a stroppy teenager. Okay, Elendil loves his children and also shirks his responsibilities. We then see Galadriel visiting Halbrand in prison after he was arrested for street fighting and presumably for stealing. Galadriel says that she no longer feels like she doesn't belong in Numenor.
You do not belong on this island.
If there's one of us that doesn't belong here, Alf, it's you.
I'm not so sure of that anymore.
That was certainly quick. And states that she now knows that Halbrand is hiding something. She shows Halbrand another scroll that she found in the Hall of Lore containing a sigil that is identical to the one that Halbrand wears around his neck. Halbrand says that he found it on a dead man and thought it suited him, nothing more. Galadriel then says that no, in fact, Halbrand is the king of the Southlands.
But what does that have to do with it?
No. He's got a point.
And her reason for saying this is that a man bearing the same mark on the scroll united the tribes of the Southlands, and that because Halbrand has the same mark on his necklace, this means that he is the descendant of the king. Halbrand tells us that his ancestor swore a blood oath to Morgoth, and
I don't want it.
So, going purely from what this scene tells us, we do not know with certainty that Halbrand is in fact the descendant of the king of the Southlands, but I'm going to presume that he is, and that both Galadriel and Halbrand are being truthful to each other in this scene. Once again, Galadriel is making incredible logical leaps by piecing together evidence that is insufficient. There are an infinite number of reasons why Halbrand might have a necklace with this mark on it. That he is the descendant of the king of the Southlands is one possibility. My presumption is that, as with everything, Galadriel will of course turn out to be right on the money here because she is really smart, you see. Plus, I do find the thought of the writers of Rings of Power sat in their boardroom brainstorming things that made Lord of the Rings good, and then one of them says there's got to be a man he's the king, but he'd want to be the king, and then he's got to be the king. So then they invented the character of Halbrand to fill this role. Furthermore, if indeed Halbrand is the king, then it makes the insane contrivance of him accidentally crossing paths with Galadriel in the ocean that much more absurd. Anyway, the scene ends with Galadriel asking Halbrand to come with her so they can both redeem their bloodlines, even though Halbrand's is the only one that apparently needs redeeming, and she indicates that she is about to acquire an army to help them. Okay, so Galadriel believes for some reason that her bloodline needs redeeming, and Halbrand is probably the king, and dislikes his ancestors due to their oath to Morgoth. We then see the Queen Regent telling her father,
"It is here, Father. The moment we feared. The elf has arrived."
Gotta get that cliffhanger in, don't we? And we then return to the Harfoots, who are now migrating. Poppy stops to observe Nori's father struggling with his cart, while these assholes just keep going their merry way without a second thought. Then the Not Wizard reveals himself, and helps them keep up with the other Harfoots, even though doing so would presumably result in their family being decaravanned, but for real this time, because using an outsider as a pack mule is almost certainly considered to be breaking the rules. But because the Harfoots are apparently ruthless, self-serving cretins, it's not like Nori and her family actually have much of a choice, is it? And we then return to the elves in the slave camp, and the Watch Warden does a foot chain attack. It's super effective. and the elves attempt to free themselves. Before I continue, I will highlight at this point that this entire scene relies on people being able to cut through their iron chains with swords. They do find themselves in a bit of a pickle, but then Arondir does this. This seems kinda cool and in character, I think, but there are some issues. Firstly, it sure is a good thing that the orcs don't have any bows or ranged weapons, or they're all dead. Secondly, this structure was apparently held together by paper and string because it collapses with barely a touch. We then see that the orcs, now exposed to sunlight, appear to almost literally start burning. Now on the back foot, the orcs decide to...
Release the warg!
Oh, because it was like, it's in the thing with the other, I remember although I do find it curious that they only have a single warg, given that there are a lot of orcs here, but maybe, I guess, Lord Bezos could only afford one. So, I have seen some people complaining about the visual effects on the warg, and in this shot in particular, I have to agree. It looks like it spawned from a PlayStation 4 game, and it also appears to somehow be lit from below, which definitely doesn't make it blend in at all with the background. Here, it looks a little better, and when I say better, I mean in terms of looking more real. The design of the warg, however, makes it look like a spastic cartoon monster.
It's not funny, Ed.
Seriously, why do they keep redesigning the wargs? The wargs in the Two Towers looked like a kind of orcified version of a dog, and they look at least somewhat believable. The wargs in The Hobbit looked like giant edgelord turbo wolves that were drawn by an 8-year-old Transformers fan, and the warg in Rings of Power looks like an oversized pug that has just had 10 condoms full of cocaine burst inside its stomach. Anyway, this little beastie mauls these two guys before Arondir is able to pull on its chain, suggesting that Arondir is very, very strong. Anyone who has walked a large dog before will know that if they don't want to be pulled in a direction, it will not be easy to pull them in that direction, and this warg is at least the size of a very, very large tiger. Anyway, the warg then charges Arondir, who does a backflip and dodges it, and because the warg is a spaz, it falls over and gets stuck in the tree. The orcs decide to then get involved, and they pull on Arondir's chain to get him away from the warg. Arondir grabs a twig and shanks this dude in the neck, which is a callback that I actually quite like, as this particular orc forced Arondir to chop down that very tree.
Very good, Kronk.
We then get the first use of a ranged weapon in this entire scene, which makes me wonder why no one used them earlier, and the warg is defeated. Arondir and the Watchwarden escape, except that the Watchwarden has just been Boromir'd. How unfortunate. If only I gave the smallest dribble of shits about this guy. Arondir is then pulled back into the hole and is nearly executed before the orcs are ordered to bring him to Adar. Oh boy, cliffhanger time. What the writers apparently didn't notice was that they have made Arondir very fast, strong, and agile, which is perhaps appropriate for an elven soldier, but then they have him get overpowered by 2 orcs. If not for the Deus Ex Machina of the guy off screen saying, "Wait, don't kill him, bring him to Adar," Arondir would have been killed here. He should have been fighting for his goddamn life. It's almost like he read ahead and knew how many episodes he was going to be in. Okay, so Arondir in this scene was confirmed to be very, very strong, extremely agile, but can be overpowered by 2 orky boys. Now then, let's take a look at each plot thread to see what this episode wanted to do with each character. We will look at where they started, we will look at where they finished, and we will decide to what degree the writers accomplished their goals. Let's start with the Arondir plot. The writers needed to show that the orcs are searching for something, and they're using captured humans and elves to locate it. They needed to establish that the orcs are violent and sadistic, and that Arondir is driven by a desire for peace. The show made the interesting decision to have Arondir's fellow soldiers from the Tirharad garrison be here, which allowed for them to be killed in ways that elicit an emotional response from Arondir, and I assume the intention is for the audience to also feel sad for them. One problem with this is that Medhor had about a minute of screen time and no character traits to speak of, except that he has trouble pronouncing certain words.
Did you draw some water? Toiling nightly to find it for their leader.
And the Watchwarden was simply an exposition dumping machine and a not very closeted racist. Another problem is that these characters being present raises the rather important question of how the hell did an elven garrison get abducted and enslaved? These guys had just received orders from Gil-galad to leave the garrison, meaning they were in communication with some kind of military personnel, if not Gil-galad himself. This would suggest that their new orders were to return to Lindon or perhaps to some other outpost elsewhere. Either way, them being captured and seemingly disappearing simply has to be noticed by the elves.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
Maybe this will be acknowledged later in the series. Maybe Gil-galad's military advisor will tell him, "Yo fam, the garrison of elves never showed up," and Gil-galad would reply, "Which one?" And the advisor would tell him, "The one with the racist guy." And Gil-galad would then send word to some nearby troops to go and check it out, leading to the discovery of whatever the orcs are doing. Wait, that can't happen. That's Galadriel's job. We can't have Gil-galad stepping on her toes. So anyway, it seems to me like the writers decided that Medhor and the Watchwarden were also here to service an emotional payoff with no regard for the consequences of this in terms of world building. If, however, this changes in future, I will revisit this sequence of events. Ultimately, the prisoners try to escape. They fail, and Arondir, the only survivor, is taken to see Adar. So, first off, the only reason why any of this happened is because Arondir decided to explore an ominous hole in a ruined village with no backup in episode 2. This is out of character, as Arondir is established to be intelligent. We also see that he can be restrained by 2 orcs who would have executed him if not for the Deus Ex Machina. This contradicts his established physical strength and fighting prowess. We also have weapons that are inexplicably not used in spite of them being present. We have enemies that act like idiots, and we have blind luck causing the plot to progress. In spite of a couple of nice payoffs that were adequately set up, this plot is not doing particularly well. I don't know where the character of Arondir is going to end up, but so far, his journey has been disobeying his superiors to meet Bronwyn, which is a character-driven moment that informs us of what his values are, conveniently encountering the man with the cow goo, which is a random occurrence of blind luck, deciding to investigate Horden, which is also a character-driven moment, and then exploring a hole like a moron and getting captured, which is a character-breaking moment. Then in this episode, Arondir fights back against the orc slavers, which is, again, character-driven, only to fail and be at their mercy in a way that is inconsistent with his established power level. So, in a word, this plot is broken because whilst the characters are, at times, using Arondir to further the plot, they seem to, for the most part, be relying on random encounters and spouts of good luck. Now, let's cover the Nori plot. This plot needed to establish that there are serious consequences for Nori's decision to help the strange man who fell from the sky, and it needed to resolve, to some degree, the conflict between Nori's family and Nori herself. So, this plot, simply put, destroys any sympathy that I have for the Harfoot society, and I'm pretty sure this was not the writer's intention. The Harfoots are depicted as simple, happy, whimsical, and carefree, but we also learn in this episode that they will literally abandon members of their village if they fall behind. The show also wants us to think that Nori's father is unable to migrate due to Nori spending time with the stranger instead of helping her father, but, as I said in the last video, his injury is entirely his own fault, meaning that this key conflict in Nori's character is at odds with the information we are presented in the show. We learn that Nori is so dedicated to helping the stranger that she is willing to blackmail her friend Poppy and steal the village elder's book, which, whilst is partly in character, as she doesn't like following the rules, it seems very much out of character that she would blackmail Poppy, even if she does so in a somewhat light-hearted manner. The method by which the stranger reveals himself accidentally to the Harfoots is utterly comical and not in a good way. If his intention was to cause as much of a fuss as possible and to make clear that Nori has been a naughty, naughty girl, then he couldn't have done a better job. The consequences of this also do not function as I believe the writers intended. What I think they wanted to happen was for Nori to be berated for breaking the rules, for her father to fall behind as a result of his broken ankle, which was also caused by Nori breaking the rules, and for the stranger to help them, thus requiring Nori's family to trust him and put their differences aside. And I guess to also realize that what Nori was doing, when she should have been helping her family, was to some degree worthwhile. What actually happened, though, is that Nori was berated for breaking the rules, and as a punishment, her family are told to walk at the back of the convoy, which essentially means that all of the other Harfoots, except Poppy, are willing to let Nori and her family get left behind and presumably die horribly in the wilderness. It is appropriate and in character for Sadok to punish Nori for breaking the rules, but instead of decaravanning them, as he is supposed to do given their laws, he decides to just make them walk at the back. It would have made more sense for Sadok to simply decaravan them, but had this happened, we couldn't have had the uplifting ending where the stranger helps Nori's family. Therefore, the writers made Sadok act out of character in order to deliver an emotional payoff. And finally, we come to the meat of the episode, which is Galadriel and Halbrand's plot. The writers needed Galadriel and Halbrand to be taken to Numenor to explain what and where Numenor is, for Galadriel to inform both us and the Numenorians of her goals. It also needed to introduce the character of Elendil, as well as his son Isildur and his daughter Eärien. The writers needed Elendil to turn Galadriel away from her immediate goal long enough for her to discover the various pieces of information about the Mark of Sauron and Halbrand's true lineage. They needed to inform us of Halbrand's character by seeing his actions in various situations, and eventually to reveal to us that he is the descendant of the King of the Southlands, and that Galadriel's plan is for both of them to return to the Southlands with an army. As you might expect from the show at this point, the Galadriel plot is nonsensical on almost every level. The introduction of Elendil and his family is inoffensive in that it largely makes sense. The biggest crime is that it's guilty of being really, really boring. Well, and establishing that Elendil will do what the sea tells him, even if what the sea tells him is to commit treason. The writers do succeed in providing relevant and important information to the audience about Numenor in a natural and explicable way by using the characters that are present. Where everything falls apart, however, is the subsequent audience with the Queen Regent and Elendil taking Galadriel to the Hall of Lore. Galadriel is incredibly confrontational with the Queen Regent, which somewhat neuters the impact that I think this scene was intended to have. Galadriel speaks to her as if she is a child, when in fact she could literally be killed at any moment, indicating that she is either exceedingly unintelligent or that she is extremely reckless. The following scene with Elendil additionally does not function on pretty much any level. The goal with this scene was simple. Going into it, we have Galadriel having escaped the palace with clear intent to steal a boat, presumably through violent if not lethal means, and sail to Middle-earth. The writers can't have this happen, of course, because it would mean that she would never learn about Halbrand, and it would mean she is somewhat difficult to take seriously as a sympathetic character. Although saying that, the writers failed to do this in the first goddamn scene of the show, and continue to fail in every scene this character appears in. So, in order to prevent Galadriel from leaving Numenor, we need Elendil to either force or convince her to stay. The way he does this is by casually saying that he can't let her steal the boat, leading to Galadriel threatening to kill him, leading to Elendil suggesting that killing him might be a mistake, leading to Galadriel saying,
"Whatever, I do what I want,"
leading to Elendil revealing that he speaks Elvish. This revelation immediately changes Galadriel's mind. And when Elendil says he learned Elvish at the Hall of Lore, Galadriel immediately asks him to take her there. He has no reason to take her there other than to avoid her stealing and presumably killing innocent people, but then you would think it would be more prudent to arrest her. And the only reason that Galadriel could possibly have for wanting to go there is that she heard the word Elvish and decided to put her plans on hold in order to check it out, thereby implying that all it takes to steer Galadriel off her centuries-long oath of vengeance against Sauron is for a human to speak Elvish to her. If I were to be as charitable as I possibly can be, the show is telling us that Galadriel realized that she is not the enemy of the Numenorians due to their historical connections with her people, a connection which some Numenorians in some parts of Numenor still uphold, and therefore she feels compelled to check it out. Even if this is what we take from the scene, and I don't think the writers did anywhere near a sufficient job of communicating this, I still don't believe that the character of Galadriel, as we have seen her depicted thus far, would spend 1 second longer in Numenor than absolutely necessary. Of course, as a direct result of deciding to go to the Hall of Lore, Galadriel ends up learning not 1, but 2 plot-crucial pieces of information, Halbrand's heritage and Sauron's evil plan, but she can't have known that she was going to learn this information previously, meaning that both Galadriel and Elendil acted out of character in order to advance the plot. I have already broken down the numerous issues with the information that Galadriel discovers at the Hall of Lore, so I won't repeat myself. Instead, I will move on to the Halbrand scene. So, Halbrand's intention seems quite clearly to be to start a new life on Numenor, away from whatever life it was that he left behind. His actions to accomplish this are to apply for a job in an open and honest way, to almost provoke a fight only to then think better of it, instead deciding to distract in order to steal the man's guild crest, and to then be attacked by the man he stole from and unleash the beast, so to speak, and annihilate these men in the streets before being arrested. This sequence of events tells us that Halbrand seems to genuinely want to live a simple life as a blacksmith, and that he is willing to steal in order to do so rather than by earning it. The writers have to magically spawn a reasonable amount of money into his pockets so that he can buy a substantial amount of alcohol for the citizens of Numenor, which, as if it needs saying, is an instance of the writers bending the fabric of reality so as to lead Halbrand in the direction that they want him to go in. We also learn that whilst Halbrand appears to very much want to avoid fighting, once he pops, he just can't stop. I was getting something of a Jekyll and Hyde vibe from this, as he was pleading with the man not to beat him up, not for his sake, but for theirs, suggesting that he maybe was not in control of his own actions. Now, whether he was just unleashing a load of masculine rage, or whether there is more to this than we are told, I can't say yet, so I can't judge it beyond saying that Halbrand is extremely physically capable, and extremely dangerous to the point of being sadistic in a fight. Finally, we learn that apparently Halbrand is in fact the descendant of the King of the Southlands, a duty which he is aware of but does not want, hence him trying to start a new life in Numenor, and presumably the reason why he was on the boat when we first met him in episode 2. Again, I can't praise or criticize this much yet because I don't know where it goes, but for the moment it very much seems like they are setting Halbrand up as something of a retread of Aragorn's story arc from The Lord of the Rings. Both men are scruffy, mysterious loners who are the descendants of kings, both have lost faith in the race of men and have no desire to lead them against the forces of evil, and presumably both will be forced to overcome this flaw and step up to the plate. So, that brings us to the end of episode 3 of Rings of Power. What can I possibly say about this one in conclusion? I'll start with the things I like. Numenor looks cool. Now onto the bits that matter. In this episode, the writers show us that Arondir is incredibly strong and also incredibly weak. We have orcs that forget that they don't like sunlight and forget to use weapons that we know they have access to. We have Arondir's life being saved by something he had zero control over. We have the Harfoot Society being depicted as a very insular, close-knit group of people who help each other out, whilst also being a cult of maniacs who don't care about each other. We have Arondir, Sadok, Galadriel, and Elendil all acting out of character in order to advance the plot. We have Galadriel making incredible leaps in logical deduction, which will of course turn out to be correct, and we learn that some guy worked out what Sauron's evil plan is and wrote it down in a language no one can read, and somehow this scroll made its way to Numenor for Galadriel to discover. I think that episode 3 is hands down the worst of the first 3 episodes of Rings of Power, because all 3 of its plots rely almost entirely on lucky contrivances and characters doing things that they would have no reason to do. This episode has cemented my opinion that Rings of Power is terrible, and I believe that at this point it is almost impossible for the writers to salvage the show. Well, if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I do plan to continue doing these as I get time, but I don't know how long it will be until I release episode 4. If you want to see me continue to do these, please leave a like, consider subscribing, drop me a comment, because if nothing else, it motivates me to get the next episode done. If you have any thoughts, if you agree, you disagree, or you think I missed something, please let me know in the comments. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you in my next video.